Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. This week, we are back into the topic in culture with the motion this house would return is cultural treasures and museums to the place of origin. Have you been to any museums when young? Museum is a great place to learn and explore for students and adults alike. It displays historical monuments from all around the world, and many people come to famous museums to understand different cultures and to see and admire the treasures from the past. I remember when I was young, when I visited some museums and I saw the Egyptian mummies, I was so fascinated that I really studied the Egyptian history and the culture and whatnot. Most of times, museums are owned by the government, meaning that the treasures from the ancient world is not for myself or you or anyone to keep it, but for the public, for the whole people to enjoy and learn from them. So yes, the safest place for any type of treasure to be in would be the museum. To name a few, well, there are Smithsonian Museum in the US, the Louvre Museum in Paris, and the British Museum in England. In those museums, you'll find ancient treasures from Egypt, China, Europe, Greece, Roman Empire, pretty much entire history of the humankind in one place. Very cool, isn't it? But have you wondered, how did the Egyptian mummies end up in British History Museum? Surely it did not walk itself all the way there, like a horror story or movies. So how did the treasures end up there? Well, as you know, throughout the human history, there were countless wars fought between people. War and subsequent looting, meaning that you raid or take away treasures of defeated people, has been a common practice since ancient times. So whenever you win the war, there goes the treasure hunt. People will just take whatever that is very valuable from people. And that's how some of the treasures end up in US, England, or different places. Now, let's look at some really famous historical treasures that were taken away. Take example the stele of King Naram Sin of Akkad, which was raided back in almost 2000 BC and it was taken into Iran. And then later, it was also discovered by a French archaeologist and now is displayed in the Louvre Museum in Paris. So it was in Iran and now it went to Paris. For another magnificent treasure, the Parthenon marbles is really the masterpiece of classical Greek sculpture. And this was removed from the Parthenon Athens in 1801 by Lord Elgin and was sold to British Museum. So it was started off in Greece and it ended up just sold into England. So obviously, Greece has consistently demanded to return their national treasure because it's theirs since independence in 1830, but British Museum or Britain has consistently said, no, I'm not going to return. Perhaps the worst case of art plundering or looting was wartime during the Nazi, and they took all the public and private holdings in Europe and took it in Russia, and they took it back to Germany. And this looting was this it really ravaged and destroyed almost 2,000 Russian churches and 237 Catholic churches and 500 synagogues. So you can see a lot of treasures were just taken away due to war or just some other countries take it away, and that's where it just ended up in different museums. So now we are faced with the truth. The ugly truth was that museums were made from treasures, which many of them were stolen without permission from long time ago. So of course, if you're Greece or Iran, you want these treasures back. And were there any efforts to send these treasures back? Well, yes, there was. Now, in 1970s, UNESCO drafted the Convention of the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. So that's a long word, but basically it means that we will all work together to return these treasures, cultural treasures, back to the original place. So to date, 88 countries said they will work together to return those treasures. But only two major countries signed the treaties, like France and United States. The rest of the Western nations, which has the most number of stolen treasures, well, unfortunately, they didn't really sign this treaty. So a lot of these major museums will still, for example, the British Museum will hold the Greece treasures, Egypt treasures, Asia treasures like Korea or Japan or China, but they will not return the treasures back to the countries. Now, to be fair, although many of the museums are still saying no to returning the treasures, there were some efforts and results. The photo you see on the left is Uige, the ancient palace book of records that were taken away from Korea during the Korea-France War back in 19th century. They were returned back in the year 2011. You can also see some Chinese artwork that were taken away during the Sino-China War and they were given back to China. So you can see that some treasures eventually come back to its place of origin, but many other treasures are yet to arrive, and it will take a long time for these treasures to go back to their own country. So this process of sending the treasures back home is called repatriation, returning the treasures. Is that always the good thing to do? Should museums from all over the world return all these treasures back to the countries? Well, some say yes, but not always that this is an easy process. First, there is enormous cost involved to send this treasure. They're not humans and they don't walk around. The Egyptian mummies cannot walk around. And some of them are extremely fragile. So a little bump and it will just break. And there goes the treasure. So the way to send them back is a very difficult procedure. Secondly, if we send back all the treasures from the museum, well, first of all, museums, a lot of museums needs to close down, and all of them, like these really important Rosetta Stone that you see in the picture, will go back to Egypt, and people just need to travel to different places to see this museum. Now, given that most people travel to US, UK, France to really see this treasure, now they have to go to Syria, Iran, Egypt, which is much more harder to go. So, a study showed if Rosetta Stone was moved from the British Museum to Cairo Museum, the number of people will drop half. So, about 5.5 million visitors went to Paris Museum. But if it's moved to Egypt, only 2.5 million people will get to see it. Also, some of these countries where these treasures originated or where the treasures come from are still at war or in very unstable condition. Returning back these treasures may also bring more harm because countries who receive it may not be ready for it. They don't have proper ways to keep the treasure safe. So it may be safest that the treasure stay in the museum. What if you return to Syria and it gets bombed and the cultural treasure is lost for good? Now let's go into the arguments. So should we return all these cultural treasures in the museum back to their own country, or should we just keep it? Now, if you're in the pro team, you're going to say, yeah, we have to return it to the place of origin. And really the value that comes from the pro team is that, look, these people from the country of origin has the right of ownership, and sending back this cultural treasure back to Europe or Greece or Egypt or Korea or other nations is ethically right, and it benefits the people who owns them. Imagine it. It's your country's treasure and some people took it away. You have the right to say, this is mine, so you give it back to me. First argument is that cultural treasure is understood best in the place of origin. Of course, you can go to British Museum and look at the Chinese painting and you can say, oh, this is such a nice painting. But if you return it back to China, people will understand it better because Chinese people know their history the best. So they can display it and explain it to the best way possible. So cultural treasure can be understood at best when it's in the place where they belong. You can also say we need to fix the mistakes on the past. War, looting, raiding, treasure hunts. these are all the mistakes that we made on the different nations. Just because the country is weak, we cannot just say that we'll just take it away from them. So we need to fix the mistakes of the past, and therefore we need to say, look, this is a time that we need to really do this, because if we don't do it now, we'll lose our chance. Thirdly, you can say that these cultural treasures were taken illegally, so we need to give it back. If you think about it, no one asked for permission of Egypt when they took out the mummies, the statues, and they took it to, England. Have you ever asked the government? Of course, the government will say no. And they were illegal. So if you take away something illegal, you must give it back because it is not right in the eyes of the law. You can also say, if you give it back, the receiving countries, usually the developing nations, will benefit from returned goods. Take, for example, I'm using Egypt a lot, but let's just take example of Egypt. Now, a lot of people visit Egypt to look at the pyramids, but if you return back all the goods that were raided and looted, so they get the mummies back, all the statues of the pharaohs back, then more people will go to Egypt to look at these wonderful history of humans. Then that will benefit the country because more people will visit and pay a lot of money to that country. So country will economically gain by returning, by these treasures being returned to their place to origin. So these are some of the arguments that I can think of in the pro team. Now, if you're in the con side or con team, you can say, well, yeah, the idea itself is great, but it's really not the best way to solve it. And the value I want to say is utility, meaning, yes, in the past, maybe 300, 400 years ago, their ancestors made a mistake and then they looted, so it somehow ended up here. But just because of that, like, we need to close down all the museum and return it back is not really the best case. It won't really benefit the people of the sending nation or receiving nation. The first argument that I can think of is that moving the cultural treasures back will stop the research. If you think about it, a lot of, like the archaeologists study from the museum. And museum is the best place because you can learn about history, but also for the archaeologists or researchers, they go and they learn and they study this treasures. Think about zoo debate. If you want to learn about tigers, you can go to the wild or you can go to zoos. Likewise, museum is a valuable place for researchers to learn about the history and our past. If you take it away, where are you going to learn it? Secondly, these cultural treasures can be appreciated in different places. You don't have to go to China to look at the Chinese painting. You can also enjoy the Chinese painting in the other museums in US, Korea, Japan, and people from different nations, or even like even if you're living in Hong Kong, you can see some of the treasures from other nations and appreciate the different cultures. You can also say cultural treasures should be in a places where most number of people can enjoy. Think about it. Is it easier for us to travel to Syria or Ethiopia to look at the treasures, or is it easier for us to go to UK or France? Obviously, due to many of the obvious reasons, although it'll be nice to travel to Syria or different countries, sometimes it's not that easy. So it's most efficient to put it in a places where most people can come at the same time and where most people can enjoy and learn from the treasures. And that would be the major museums in the world. Lastly, sending back cultural treasures can be very dangerous and difficult. I just talked about some of the examples, like these places where it's still very, there's a lot of wars or instabilities, or some of like the places like Syria, the some of the radical governments will destroy the treasures because they don't believe in the ancient gods anymore, so they just destroy it. So some of these things are the reasons why museums are refusing to send back the cultural treasure, because they want to keep the treasure safe and it is the best place to be in the museum. So those are all the arguments from pro and con that I can think of. Now, I hope that you can read a bit more in the reading because it will give you a lot of facts, statistics, and the reasoning behind. But until then, I will definitely see you in debate. So thank you for listening to my video, and I'll see you in class. Bye bye.